2 pounds of bread every single day. That is not a diet challenge, and it is not a baker's boast. That was survival for a medieval peasant. And whether or not you had it decided, something very simple and very brutal, whether your family lived to see the end of March. So set yourself down. It is a grey morning around the year 1320, in a small village in the flat English countryside, though it could as easily be northern France, or the German plains, or half of Christian Europe, because the shape of this life was nearly the same across all of it. You are no knight, no lord in a stone hall. You are a villain, a peasant bound to the land you were born on, one of the 90 in every 100 whose whole existence turned on one thing above all, getting enough grain and turning it into food before the winter or the spring could finish you. Real people in real villages, screaming that they were burning alive, seeing things that were not there, their fingers and feet turning black while they still breathed, all of it carried in on the same loaf they ate at every meal. But you cannot understand that horror until you understand the bread itself. So let us begin where every medieval day began, with the loaf. Reach for it. It is nothing like the soft white bread you know. It is dark, dense, heavy in the hand, the crust almost black, the crumb close and chewy and sour. This is maslin bread, and the word simply means mixed, a loaf baked from whatever grew in your fields together, wheat and rye sown in the same ground and ground into the same flour, sometimes barley too, sometimes beans and peas swept in when the harvest was thin. The pale, fine white bread, the wheaten manchet that went to the manor house, to the Lord's table. What you ate was the colour of the earth it came from, and you ate a staggering amount of it. Historians who have gone through the household accounts and food allowances of working peasants, men like Christopher Dyer, who spent a career reconstructing what ordinary people actually ate, find that bread and grain gave something close to half of everything, and often more, 1 to 2 pounds of it per person every day. When a man went out to swing a scythe from first light to dark in the harvest, that was fuel, and there was no other fuel like it. The bread was so central, it even became your plate. The poorest ate off a trencher, a thick slab of stale, days-old bread that soaked up the pottage, and at the meal's end you ate the sodden trencher too, or gave it to the beggar at the door. Nothing was wasted, but before that grain could ever become bread, it had to be ground, and here is the first hard truth of this life. You did not own that right. In most villages, by law and by custom, you were forbidden to grind your own corn at home. There was one mill, and it belonged to the Lord, and you were bound to carry your grain to it, and to pay for the grinding, a portion of your own flour taken by the miller, the toll they called multure. This was no small resentment. At the great abbey of St. Albans, the monks guarded the monopoly so fiercely that when they caught the townsfolk grinding at home on their own hand-querns, they seized the stones and paved the abbot's parlour floor with them, and the townsfolk never forgot it. 2 generations later, in the great rising of 1381, the men of St. Albans dug those millstones back out of the floor and broke them into fragments, tokens of a freedom they believed they had won. That is how deep the grievance of the Lord's mill ran. Your bread was taxed before it was ever baked, and often it was baked at the Lord's oven too, for another fee, because even the fire that made your loaf could belong to someone else. Now, bread was the floor of the medieval diet, the great heavy foundation. But a person cannot live on bread alone, and the thing that stood beside the loaf in every single household, rich or poor, was the pot, the pottage. Somewhere near you, hanging over the open hearth in the middle of the floor, no chimney, just a hole in the roof and the smoke drifting up through the rafters, is an iron or an earthenware pot, and in that pot something is always cooking. Pottage was a thick soup or a loose porridge, and it was the true daily meal of the poor. Into it went oats or barley to thicken it, and then whatever the garden and the season gave you, peas, beans, onions, leeks, cabbage, garlic, a handful of herbs, parsley and sage. In many houses the pot was never truly emptied. You ate from it, and then the next day's grain and greens went in on top of what was left, and it simmered on, day after day, week after week, a living thing at the very centre of the home. Now notice what is not in it. There are no potatoes. There are no tomatoes, no sweet corn, no runner beans of the kind you might picture, no peppers, no pumpkin as a common food. Every one of those was still unknown in Europe, an ocean away in lands no European had yet reached. There is no sugar in a bowl. What sweetness there was came from honey. There is no coffee and no tea. The pottage on that fire is greens and grain, and, on a lucky day, a scrap of bacon fat melted through it for flavour, and its smell, earthy, oniony, smoky, faintly sour, was the smell of home itself. Alongside it might come what they called white meats, the food of the dairy, a crumble of hard cheese, a little butter, an egg when a hen was generous, eaten from a shared wooden bowl with a spoon, your fingers, and the knife at your belt. There were no forks. The fork was still a strange foreign fashion no farmer had heard of. And to drink? Not water. This surprises people every time, but the everyday drink of medieval Europe, for men, for women, and even for children, was ale. Weak ale, what they called small ale, brewed low and mild, and drunk fresh because it soured within days. A working adult might get through a gallon of it a day. And here is a detail that matters. Brewing was women's work. In village after village, the brewer was an alewife, a woman turning her own kitchen into a small business, and so many people brewed and sold ale that the crown reached in to regulate it directly. The assize of bread and ale, set down in England in 1266, fixed the price and the strength of both the loaf and the tankard, and the manor courts fined the alewives who watered it or sold it short, year after year, by the hundred. This ale was not the clear, hopped, bitter beer you know either. Hops had not yet come into English brewing. It was cloudy, sweetish, faintly sour, thick enough that some called it liquid bread, and it too was food, more calories floating in the cup. So that is your ordinary day. Dark bread, thick pottage, sour ale, and you will have noticed something missing from all of it: meat. For a medieval peasant, meat was not a daily thing. It was an event. You might keep a single pig, because a pig will eat anything and turn scraps into bacon, and around the 11th of November at Martinmas, as the real cold came on, that pig was killed, and that was one of the great moments of the whole year. The salting and the smoking of the meat that had to see you through the winter hung dark and hard from the rafters. A hen was worth far more alive for her eggs than dead in the pot. Beef and mutton usually meant an old, worn-out ox that could no longer pull the plough, or a sheep past its usefulness. Fresh roasted meat in any quantity belonged to the feast, to Christmas, a wedding, the harvest supper the Lord laid on when the last sheaf was safely in. On an ordinary Tuesday there was fat, not flesh, a knob of bacon dissolved into the pottage, and that was riches enough. But there was another reason the meat was so often absent, and it had nothing to do with poverty and everything to do with the church, because you did not simply eat what you could afford, you ate what you were permitted. And for something close to a third of the entire year, the church forbade you meat altogether. Think about the sheer size of that. Historians of medieval food, scholars like Bridget Ann Hennish and C.M. Woolgar, count them up for us every Friday in memory of the crucifixion. In many places every Wednesday and every Saturday as well. The whole of Lent, 40 days with no meat, no eggs, no butter, no cheese. Advent in the run-up to Christmas, the Ember Days, the long vigils before the great feasts. Add them together and well over 100 days a year, perhaps 150, were fast days, lean days, when no flesh of any beast could pass your lips. And what filled that enormous holy gap? Fish. Salted herring above all, packed by the barrelful and carted far inland, and stockfish, cod dried until it was hard as a plank and had to be soaked and pounded for hours before you could chew it, and eels from the fen and whatever the local river gave up, a full third of your year, eaten to the rhythm of the church calendar, tasted of salt and fish. Now, hold on, because everything I have described so far, the bread and the pottage and the salt herring, all of that was the good part of the year. That was the peasant diet at its very best, in the fat months just after harvest when the barns were still full. Now let me show you April, because the medieval food year was not a flat line. It was a slow, grinding curve downward into hunger. The harvest came in at the end of summer, and for a while there was enough. Then, month by month through the winter, the stores went down, the grain in the barn, the salt meat on the hook, the peas and beans in the crock, all of it eaten steadily away with nothing new coming in, because nothing grows in a European winter. And by the time you reached the far end of it, the late winter and the raw early spring, March, April into May, you hit the stretch that historians have given a bleak and simple name, the Hungry Gap. The old food was nearly gone, the new food was not yet ripe, the crops just green threads in cold ground, the animals thin and giving almost nothing. This was the dangerous season, every single year, even a good one. The belts pulled tighter, the pottage went thin and grey, and the weakest, the very old, the very young, began quietly to slip away. Spring, the season we picture as new life and green shoots, was for the medieval peasant the season most likely to starve you to death. And when the harvest did not merely thin but truly failed, the hungry gap became something far worse than hard. Between the years 1315 and 1317, Europe discovered exactly how thin its margin really was. It began with rain. In the spring of 1315 it started to rain across the whole of northern Europe, and it very nearly did not stop. Week after week, month after month, the fields turned to standing mud, the grain rotting or never ripening at all. The harvest failed, and then, unthinkably, the next year it failed again. This is what we call the Great Famine, and the historian William Chester Jordan has traced its path across the continent. Grain prices doubling and tripling, people eating their own seed corn, which meant next year's hunger was baked into this year's survival, and then, at the end, eating things that were not food at all. A cattle plague followed hard behind, in 1319 and 1320, killing the oxen that were left. In those few terrible years, something like 1 person in 10 across great stretches of northern Europe simply died. Millions of people gone from a diet that in the best of times balanced on a knife's edge and, when the rains came, slid straight off it. That was the true face of a life in which bread was half of everything. Lose the grain, and you lost the world. And this is the thing I want you to actually feel before we reach the end. Go and open your own kitchen, right now, in your mind. Look at what is in it. The fridge that hums all night, keeping a week of food cold. The shelf of tins that would not spoil in a year. The plain fact that if it all ran out this evening, you would walk to a shop and there would be more, endlessly more, from every corner of the earth, fresh fruit in the dead of winter, and you would not think about it. For the peasant at that hearth, none of it existed. There was only what you had grown and stored with your own 2 hands, and when that was gone, it was gone. A single bad harvest was not an inconvenience to be worked around. It was a sentence of death hanging over the whole village at once, and weigh the labour behind every mouthful. A harvest worker in this England might earn 2 pence for a full day bent double under the sun, and a day's wage bought little more than the bread to keep him alive to labour again tomorrow. You spend a few minutes of an hour's pay on a loaf and think nothing of it. He spent his whole strength, every day of his life, just to stay level with his own stomach. That distance between his hearth and your fridge is one of the widest gaps in all of human history, and almost nobody stops to notice it. So now we come back to the promise I made you at the very beginning, the bread that drove villagers out of their minds. Here, at last, is how it happened. When the rye grew in a wet season, and the medieval countryside had a great many wet seasons, a fungus could quietly take hold in the ripening grain. We call it Claviceps purpurea, ergot. It grew as dark, hard, curved little spurs, standing in place of the healthy kernels, right there in the ear of rye. To a hungry family they looked like nothing much, just odd, off-coloured grains, and in a lean year you were certainly not going to throw good grain away. So the ergot went into the sack, into the mill, and into the flour, and into the daily bread, and you ate it, and your children ate it. And the ergot carried a poison. In small doses, eaten over weeks, it did unspeakable things. It choked the blood out of the fingers and toes and limbs until they burned as though thrust into a fire. People called it St. Anthony's fire, Ignis Sacer, the holy fire, and then those limbs blackened and rotted and died on the still living body. And it broke the mind. It brought convulsions, writhing fits, and violent, terrifying hallucinations. Whole rooms of people seeing and hearing things that were simply not there. When a village's bread all came from one contaminated field, this did not strike a single unlucky soul. It struck everyone at once. Entire communities could be seized together, burning, convulsing, hallucinating, in an outbreak that looked for all the world like a curse called down from heaven. In the year 944, in Aquitaine in France, one such outbreak is said to have killed many thousands. So dreaded was this affliction that a whole religious order, the Order of St. Anthony, was founded near the end of the 11th century for no purpose but to nurse its victims. The same bread that was the staff of life, that was half of everything you ate, that very same bread, in a wet and unlucky year, could burn your village to the ground from the inside. And that is the truth of it. The medieval peasant did not sit down to a diet. They sat down to a bargain, struck fresh every single day, with a loaf of dark, heavy, sour bread, a loaf that was survival and labour and prayer and, now and then, poison. all baked together into the same crust. 2 pounds of it every day in the smoke of an open fire at the very edge of never quite having enough. That was not the background of their lives. That was their lives, and every single bite of it was an act of faith that the harvest would come again.